Thanks for joining me for today's adventure on the Wine Road. I'm Jeff Davis. On today's podcast, I talk with second-generation wine grape grower Eric Titus of Titus Vineyards in Napa Valley. Now, if you enjoy the rich flavors of Napa Valley's Bordeaux varieties and Zinfandel, be sure to get to know Titus. The quality of the wines is comparable to other producers, but their prices are quite reasonable. Titus Vineyards has a fairly new, sleek, modern, eye-catching winery and tasting room on Silverado Trail north of St. Helena. Eric's family moved to Napa Valley with the intention that Eric's father would open a radiology clinic in Sonoma. The property they purchased had a vineyard, the management of which his father had interest in pursuing. He was very likely the only grape-growing radiologist in the region, if not the country. If you're familiar with Titus Vineyards, you may not realize how long they've been in the valley.
Yeah, we came into Napa Valley in 1969, and this piece of property that we're sitting on right here is 40 acres, and 30 of that 40 acres was planted at that time, and they were producing and had been growing since some of the vines even since pre-Prohibition. So we just took over the existing grape contracts, and for the first really 20 years, we were growers before we were vintners. Yeah. And we added 10 acres of vines on this property. We bought another property about a mile north of here on Ellers Lane, planted that. That was an old orchard. So farmed essentially 50 acres throughout the 70s and 80s before we made our first wine commercially. Yeah.
Your dad moved here and your family because he had a radiology practice opening up in Sonoma. Yeah. He wanted to live over here in Napa Valley. And where did you move from, and why did he choose to come up here?
Yeah, well, he went to medical school back east. He was doing his internship, residency rather, in San Francisco, at UC San Francisco in radiology, and this is back in the 50s when radiology was a very nascent arm of the medical field. Yeah. And met my mother, who was a nurse in training, and they decided to move up into the town of Sonoma, and that's where he started his medical practice. And Sonoma's, at that time was established wine growing region, and so he just naturally started an interest in wine and vineyards. And initially, they were looking in the Sonoma area in the late 60s, mid to late 60s. But eventually settled on Napa because it seemed to be there was more available. They just liked the area. And then there's also a family connection that my mother, she grew up in San Francisco in North Beach. Her parents both came from Italy, and they would come up here during the 40s on vacation. And they knew a lot of the other families up here, and they would come up and visit, very inexpensive vacation, but they would work picking prunes or nuts or grapes, and that was vacation. But so she had a connection with the area, and so in looking around both Sonoma and Napa Valley, they found this property. They liked some of the association that they felt that my mother felt with this area. So it was a natural. In those days, properties would go on the market and they would really languish. I mean, this particular property was on the market for I believe even a couple of years before we bought it. So it wasn't like it is now, where you get on with a realtor who puts you on a list and calls you when he hears of something that might be coming on the market. It's nothing like that. There's lots of properties, and there wasn't nearly as much vineyard land. There was still a lot of orchard and grazing land and whatnot. So to have an established vineyard that was, the fruit was going to existing wineries at the time. Majority of the fruit was going to Charles Krug Winery, and we just took over those contracts. A lot of talk during the 70s and 80s about having a family winery, but we finally pulled the trigger with the 1990 vintage.
But running a vineyard when you have a full-time job, that's a lot of work. Were you and your brother able to help out at that time?
We helped out, but in those days it was typical that you would have a resident vineyard manager. And so we had, all through the 70s and into the 80s, we would have a family basically living in the farmhouse that's on the property here. And that would be the vineyard manager, and his kids would go to school in town, And that was not an unusual relationship. Now it's much more farming companies and vineyard management companies are doing the management. You don't really see that arrangement, that family managed vineyard. But we, for the first 15 years, really had that kind of an arrangement where we'd had some kind of a resident vineyard manager who, of course, would then report to my father, and then we would get, myself and my brothers, we'd get plugged in to various tasks, planting, suckering, yeah.
I understand you had quite a few different varieties planted here, and Zinfandel was one of them, but with some of your neighbors' advice, your father decided to go with some Bordeaux varieties, so that was one of the early changes you made.
Yeah, well, when we first came here, Zinfandel was the predominant grape on this property, but I think that pretty well was reflective of what was going on in Napa. If you look at the statistics from back in those days, there was a lot of Petit Syrah, there's a lot of Gamay, there's a lot of Zinfandel, Carignan. There was very little Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, or Chardonnay. And when we started replanting, actually the first replants we did was just tear out old Zinfandel and put in new Zinfandel. This is in the mid-'70s, and we're still using that Zinfandel for our current Zinfandel program. So that acreage has withstood the test of time. Yeah. Those are almost 40 years old, those vines. But after that, the wineries did start calling more for Cabernet and Chardonnay. So, by now we're getting into the late 70s. There's, a few things have happened. Judgment in Paris, Robert Mondavi's ongoing campaign to promote Napa Valley. So when we started removing some of those old varietals that you just described, Carignan and Mondouse and Semillon.
Burger.
Burger, exactly. Concord. We had an acre of Concord that actually made pretty good money. In those days, you could get the same amount for Concord as you did for Cabernet. Through different channels, of course, but right. Selling it directly to grocers, but there was high demand for that. But yeah, nevertheless, there was, anytime a block came up for replanting, we were able to put in Chardonnay or Cabernet and get, demand for it. So that was late 70s into the 80s. And then we did another large replanting in the late 90s. So that was in part due to phylloxera and in part due to some of the vines that were replanted in the early 80s were just starting to run out of gas, and it was time to replant them. And then so that was another change, that we were tearing out Chardonnay and putting in things to support our Cabernet program. More Cabernet, but also Malbec, Petit Bordeaux, Cabernet Franc, that type of thing, to really orient more towards a traditional Cabernet blend.
I'm talking with Eric Titus of Titus Vineyards in Napa Valley. Eric, like many children of vineyard and winery owners, chose to pursue his own interests, leaving the vineyard behind, which is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, for me personally, that was kind of the quandary. But I was bitten by the marine bug when I was a kid, and just watching Jacques Cousteau and whatnot. During the 70s, conservation and conservation biology and ecology were all the rage, and I always was interested in pursuing that. And my crossroads in college was, do I continue to pursue that, or this was, I felt a strong draw to this field as well, fermentation science and viticulture. And so I just made up my mind that I'm going to work through what I started with the marine science, and then I'll reevaluate and see about embracing the wine business after that. So, to condense the story, I mean, that's basically what happened. But I did stay in academics for, basically longer than I intended initially. I got my doctorate in marine-related physiology, and then worked in that field for a while. But, it's, as it turned out, that was, as far as getting the family business going, that was the kind of timing that we needed. My father retired from radiology, still wasn't real sure through the 90s. We were making a little bit of wine, but not a lot, not enough to be to really be a commercial success. It was more exploratory, and it took time for us as a family to decide we're going to go to the next level.
And in the meantime, your brother Philip pursued viticulture and enology as well, so he stayed with that plant.
That's exactly right. And so he stayed on the straight and narrow. He studied plant science at Davis, and then transitioned strictly to viticulture as he got out, and then came back over here. And he worked a series of winery jobs, but ended up at Chapelet as the assistant winemaker, and then with time he became the winemaker up there. And so in the early years we were actually making our wine up there at Chapelet, and he would oversee the winemaking. So the division of labors, I was running the vineyard down here, and he was doing the winemaking, and I did the sales and marketing as well. So.
How beneficial to have Eric's brother Phil working at Chapelet Winery. Eric has some great stories of sailing the world's oceans and living in Hawaii for a while. I read that as the wine business grew in Napa Valley, his father's interest began to wane. It just didn't suit his old school ways.
Yeah, he was more about the vineyards and really much more about the vineyards in a less intensive farming. Before the 90s, when we did this replant, I was telling you in the late 90s, everything was dry farmed, and it was just it was a slower pace of farming. And that was something that he really enjoyed and could get his arms around. And then when we started tightening up the spacing and having to put in drip irrigation and dig expensive wells, and there was always something going on in the vineyard, whether you're, shoot positioning or leafing or, rearranging the clusters, fruit thinning. None of that stuff used to happen if you go back to the 70s and 80s. It was most of the work typically was in the spring, and then you would get the shoot thinning done in late May or early June, and basically walked away from the vineyards until it was harvest.
You don't see much of that going on anymore.
Not too much. and it was considered in those days that June and July were the coasting period, where you're just basically repairing the barn or painting the house type of thing, because there wasn't really anything to do in the vineyards. And now it's nonstop. And going back to my father, I think it was an escape for him from his medical practice, and I think he liked having that dichotomy in his life. So when this became a little bit more of a little more effort involved, and kind of feeling the competition ratcheting up with growing better grapes so you could get better money for it, and wineries are starting to look over the shoulder of the grower a little bit more. He was happy to turn it over to his sons, I think, at that point. Yeah.
Might have been getting a little bit older, too, as well.
That's it, too. Yeah, without question.
Well, as you kind of intimated earlier, 1990 was a pivotal year. That's when you decided to make your own wine. Yeah. And also, by that time, your brother Phil was ready to step in as a full-time winemaker, having the experience at Chapelet.
Well, in the end, it was still, at that point, we just took 10 tons of our, 180 tons that we grow to keep for Titus. We're still selling off, and all through the 90s we sold off the majority of our fruit. Yeah. And so that was for him. Actually, he was not a full-time winemaker because he maintained his position at Chapelet. In fact, he's still there at Chapelet. Oh, yeah. So he's always successfully balanced doing Titus and Chapelet, and we just became a custom crush client at Chapelet. So everyone's back got scratched. We were able to make the wine in a top-notch facility with the proper oversight, because my brother was there. They were able to utilize some of their excess space and get revenue for it. So there's nothing not to like with that setup when we were still small. And of course, once we got through the 90s, I came on board in the late 90s. So for a number of years there, it was really just everyone working in their spare time on it. Mm-hmm. And then when I came on board, that was when we needed to redevelop a lot of the vineyards, as I was telling you earlier, and we did start slowly ramping up our production. So at some point, just realized that this wine's not going to sell itself, or is a few phone calls to distributors isn't going to be enough to to continue to promote the brand. So that's when I came over and left my marine science background and came over here.
So that about 10 years later, you start thinking about building a winery. What level of production did you get to at that point? But then that's when, boom, the recession hits.
Yeah, we were inching up to towards 10,000 cases, very incrementally. It took us a while to get up to 5,000 cases, and then our goal at that time was really just to be 100% estate, but use all of our estate fruit, not sell anything off, and that was when I say a goal, that was kind of a growth goal. We figured that if we used all of our 50 acres and we were able to make the wine from those 50 acres, not had to deal with any outside customers, which it was getting more and more difficult to work with outside customers too.
If you can make enough money selling your own wine and not need that income, it's nice to be in that position.
And the one thing that was missing that whole time was we realized that we're not going to be a large winery. We need to step up our retail, and that was we don't need to just keep making more wine and putting it into the wholesale channels, because that gets to be kind of top heavy after a while. But what we really needed to do was build the retail, and we tried different things in terms of just building the wine club through different promotional efforts, but you can only go so far without having a brick and mortar building facility that people can come and visit. So it took us we finally came to that realization, if we wanted to grow past a certain level, both in volume and revenue base, that we were going to need to build a winery. And it's true that effort did get put on hold for a good 4 or 5 years, from like 2008 to 2012, while we're riding the recession out.
Yeah. Tell me about the wines you're crafting now.
Well, we have evolved, but only slowly from when we first started out. By the time when we started making wine in 1990, it was Cabernet, 10 tons of Cabernet fruit to make 600 cases. And we stuck with that, because even though that was still kind of a transition time, there's a lot of other varietals out. That was going to be our anchor point, was Cabernet. We continued to expand through the 90s, adding a little Zinfandel and Cabernet Franc, and then really just stuck to that. And we stayed in the mainstream with that. So our Cabernet program is still our driver. The big difference between now and those early years is we do utilize the blending components, Malbec, Petit Verdot, certain amount of Merlot and Cab Franc as well, and then there's cross pollination, because we also have our Cabernet Franc program, which is aggressively blended with those others as well. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where our style, I think, has gone, is that it's varietal and varietally correct wines that are made in such a way to enhance the richness and the balance through blending. Light touches of oak. We're not shy with oak, but we're certainly not using our cooperage programs to enhance or define the wines in any way.
We were talking before the interview. You're still maintaining about 10,000 cases, but you're thinking about maybe increasing that a little bit in the next few years.
A little bit, yeah. We're, we just see that now that we're in the winery and the economy's recovered, that what do you know? There's all of a sudden a demand for some of our wines that there wasn't in the throes of the downturn of the economy. We don't have vintages backing up. I think most wineries can say that now, and there's just there's a demand for Napa products, and there always has been. But I think that with there's definitely a specialization that's gone on in the last 10 years of what grows best where, what regions are recognized for what varietals, and Napa just more and more just means Cabernet, out and about, both nationally and internationally. So we just find that we embrace that. We continue to make our non-Cabernet programs, the Zinfandel and the Cabernet Franc and the Sauvignon Blanc that you have in your glass, but it really is the driver and the door opener is the Cabernet.
Sure.
Yeah.
I like that simple but attractive logo that represents your brand. You have an ancient amphora, or a wine vessel, with 3 diamonds that form a T. And I was thinking that maybe that represented something, the diamonds, but you say not necessarily. But it's a wonderful, simple logo, but it exudes class and it fits perfectly.
Yeah, and the red highlights that we've chosen to enhance the diamonds with, really, that logo just pops from across the room, and we just find that it's in its simplicity. That's where its attractiveness is, and more and more, as I was telling you earlier, we have over 25 vintages on the record now, and that logo has been with us the whole time, and it really has just become a kind of an iconic representation of Titus.
Do you or Phil have children that are going to possibly continue the legacy?
Well, we both have two boys, and they are, for the most part, in their mid to upper teens. And continue the legacy, I don't know. We have to build the legacy, I think, still, and we're still in the process of doing that. And
you, of all people, know that they might want to move on to something else, but they could come back.
It's true. And when I stopped to think that, when Philip and I were their age, we joked about coming to work in the vineyards is like one of the last things we wanted to do. So I'm pretty sure that their thinking is not too far from that. Yeah. But there's no question that they all show pride and understanding of being part of this industry, having their family as part of this industry. And my boys are college bound, and they're talking about studying business and agriculture, and not necessarily coming back to work for the family, but at least that it's given them a reference point that they seem to appreciate. And they all their friends at school, or most of their families are somehow involved in the business. And nowadays you can take a viticulture class in high school and learn how to make wine in high school, and so they're embracing that. So there's a lot of exposure from that standpoint. Who knows really where it's going to turn, because if they're like any other kids, or like I was, they're probably going to start saying they want to move to Australia and make wine or something. They not stay here in the backyard. Yeah. So.
Eric Titus of Titus Vineyards. My wife and I really enjoyed their wines, and I'll tell you, for the quality, their prices are hard to resist. Expect to buy a few bottles if you stop by. Eric is a personable guy, as you can tell, and we enjoyed his company and the wide-open view they have of their vineyard from their sleek, modern tasting room on Silverado Trail. Learn more at titusvineyards.com. That's Titus vineyards.com. If you're listening to this on iTunes or another podcast provider, you can learn more about my show at onthewineroad.com and on Facebook as well. I'm on Instagram under the name JD Wine Road and on Twitter at JD Wine Road. I'm Jeff Davis. Thanks for listening to this podcast of On the Wine Road.